2 Academy Awards, 5 Oscar nominations, 33 days in jail. In 1987, Sean Penn was sentenced to 60 days behind bars after assault charges at the height of his rising fame. In 2004 and 2009, he stood on the Oscar stage as Best Actor, applauded by the same industry that once watched him walk into a courtroom. Hollywood called him one of the greatest performers of his generation. Tabloids called him violent. How does a man win the highest honor in film after serving time as inmate 1987? In 2004, Sean Penn stood on the Academy Award stage and accepted his first Oscar for Mystic River. 5 years later, in 2009, he did it again for Milk, 2 Best Actor wins in just 5 years. Fewer than a dozen performers in modern Oscar history have achieved that. By then, he had already earned 5 Academy Award nominations in total. The industry did not just respect him, it relied on him when a role demanded emotional detonation. In Mystic River, he delivered one of the most replayed scenes of the decade, a father screaming in the street after learning his daughter is dead. The rawness felt almost unbearable. In Milk, he transformed into Harvey Milk with controlled vulnerability, balancing conviction and fragility. Hollywood rewarded him for portraying men on the edge, men carrying pressure until it explodes. But by the time he held that second statue, the record was already there. Arrest in the 1980s, a 60-day sentence, 33 days served behind bars, courtrooms before red carpets. The same industry that applauded his mastery of rage had witnessed his real-life volatility for years. Was Sean Penn shaping anger into art, or was art the only place he could contain it? Sean Justin Penn was born on August 17, 1960, in Santa Monica, California. From the outside, it looked like a privileged beginning. His father, Leo Penn, was a respected actor and director. His mother, Eileen Ryan, was also an actress. He grew up in Malibu, surrounded by artists, writers, and filmmakers. Hollywood was not a distant dream. It was a neighborhood. But comfort and stability are not the same thing. And behind the creative household was a constant undercurrent of tension, ideology, and pride that shaped him early. Leo Penn had been blacklisted in the 1950s during the McCarthy era for refusing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That experience marked him. It marked the family. Sean grew up hearing about injustice, betrayal, and political persecution. He watched his father rebuild a career that had once been stripped away. In that house, power was never abstract. It was something that could punish you, something that could exile you. For a young boy, that lesson settles deep. If the world can turn on you, you either harden or you disappear. Which choice do you think a strong-willed child would make? Malibu in the 1970s was not just beaches and sunlight. It was ego, competition, and identity. Sean was not known as the quiet kid. He was intense, stubborn, quick to defend himself. Friends described him as fiercely loyal but easily provoked. He did not like authority. He did not respond well to being told what to do. School never fully held his attention. Structure felt like confinement. Even at a young age, he leaned toward confrontation rather than retreat. Was that confidence, or was it a defense mechanism forming in real time? His 2 brothers also pursued creative paths. Competition was subtle but present. In a family where talent was a currency, proving yourself mattered. Sean did not want to be Leo Penn's son. He wanted to stand alone. That drive can create discipline. It can also create pressure that turns inward. When a boy grows up in a house where politics, art, and pride are constant themes, emotional softness rarely becomes a dominant language. Strength does. Assertion does. Control does. And when control feels threatened, what fills that gap? Teenage Sean began experimenting with filmmaking using a Super 8 camera. He and his friends shot short films around Malibu. There was creativity there, but also something else, a fascination with intensity. He was drawn to characters who struggled, who pushed back, who refused to submit. Even before fame, he gravitated toward emotional extremes. It was not enough to simply perform. He wanted to inhabit something volatile. Where does that attraction to volatility begin if not in early wiring? By his late teens, he had dropped out of school and moved toward acting full-time. There was no dramatic poverty narrative, no industry outsider story. He had access, he had connections. But access does not remove insecurity. If anything, it magnifies it. When you grow up inside Hollywood, you know exactly how fragile success can be. You see careers rise and fall. You see reputations collapse overnight. You learn early that admiration is temporary. Does that knowledge make you cautious? Or does it make you defiant? Observers later describe him as someone who reacted strongly to disrespect. The smallest slight could trigger a visible shift. Jaw tight, eyes hard, voice clipped. That pattern rarely appears out of nowhere in adulthood. It grows from years of believing you must defend your ground at all costs. In a household shaped by blacklisting and resistance, compromise might have felt like surrender. If your father refused to bow to a political machine, would you ever bow to a camera in your face? By the time Sean Penn entered his 20s, two things were firmly in place. First, undeniable talent. Second, a temperament that ran hot. He did not fear confrontation. In fact, he seemed energized by it. The foundation was built. A young man raised in privilege but shadowed by ideological conflict, determined to prove himself, allergic to humiliation, wired for intensity. The industry would soon amplify every one of those traits. And once fame arrived, that internal wiring would no longer stay private. If anger becomes part of your identity before you even know who you are, what happens when an entire world starts watching? Sean Penn's film debut came in 1981 with Taps. He was 21 years old, standing alongside rising young actors in a story about military cadets pushed a rebellion. Even in a supporting role, his presence was sharp, controlled on the surface, coiled underneath. The camera liked him. Directors noticed his focus. He did not perform like someone trying to be charming. He performed like someone trying to be real. But realism in Hollywood can quickly turn into branding. And Sean Penn was about to be branded. In 1982, Fast Times at Ridgemont High made him widely recognizable. His character, Jeff Spicoli, was a laid-back surfer stoner. The performance became iconic. It was funny, loose, almost carefree. Audiences loved it, but there was a problem. Spicoli was not who Sean Penn believed he was. He feared being reduced to a caricature. Instead of leaning into the popularity, he resisted it. He avoided interviews. He pushed back against media framing. Why accept an easy identity when you are determined to control your own narrative? By the mid-1980s, his career was accelerating, but so were the headlines. In 1985, he married Madonna. At that moment, she was one of the most famous women in the world. Together, they became a media obsession. Cameras followed them everywhere. Every glance, every argument, every rumor was amplified. Fame doubled overnight. So did scrutiny. For someone already wired to react to intrusion, this level of exposure was combustible. Between 1985 and 1987, Penn was arrested multiple times, including for assaulting paparazzi and reckless driving. In 1987, he was sentenced to 60 days in jail for violating probation after punching a film extra on the set of Colors. He served 33 days. 33 days in a county jail while still at the height of celebrity attention. Most actors at that stage of their career hire publicists to soften their image. Penn did not soften. He did not apologize publicly in the way Hollywood prefers. He absorbed the consequences and returned to work. Was that defiance, pride, or an inability to step back from his own impulses? The marriage with Madonna was intense, volatile, and short-lived. They divorced in 1989. Rumors of violence circulated for years. Allegations surfaced, denials followed, narratives clashed. The truth became layered in speculation and retraction. But the damage to public perception was permanent. He was no longer simply talented. He was dangerous. And in Hollywood, that label can either end career or create a myth. Instead of fading, he leaned into serious roles. Films like At Close Range in 1986 and Casualties of War in 1989 showed a different dimension. The humor of Spicoli was gone. In its place was emotional brutality. He played men struggling with moral conflict, loyalty, betrayal. His performances were raw, almost confrontational. Directors began to see that his intensity was not accidental. It was usable. It was powerful. During this period, he also became more openly political. He spoke out about U.S. foreign policy. He traveled abroad. He expressed strong opinions in interviews. For some, this added depth. For others, it reinforced the image of man always in a fight. The boundary between actor and activist blurred. The private path he chose was not about playing it safe. It was about refusing to be neutral. But neutrality often protects careers. Why choose friction instead? What made his trajectory unusual was not just the arrests or the marriage drama. It was a consistency of confrontation. Many stars stumble once and recalibrate. Penn did not recalibrate easily. He seemed to carry his principles and his temper into every environment. Studio executives, reporters, photographers, all could become adversaries. The industry prefers predictability. Penn preferred autonomy. Those two rarely coexist peacefully. By the early 1990s, his reputation was firmly divided. Critics praised his depth. Tabloids questioned his stability. Directors trusted his commitment. Media outlets anticipated his next outburst. He was building a serious acting career, but he was also building a history that would follow him for decades. The pattern was clear. Extraordinary focus on set, volatile reactions off it. Success was rising. So was tension. He had entered Hollywood not as a willing participant in its rules, but as someone determined to bend them. Yet, bending systems often creates backlash. And backlash, for someone already wired to resist, can feel like validation. If confrontation becomes your normal state, can you ever recognize when you are escalating instead of defending? By the mid-1990s, Sean Penn was no longer the reckless young star of tabloid headlines. He was becoming something else, an actor directors trusted with emotional weight. In 1995, Dead Man Walking placed him opposite Susan Sarandon in a story about a death row inmate facing execution. The performance was restrained, internal, stripped of theatrics. Critics took notice. He earned his first Academy Award nomination. The industry began to separate the man from a noise. But could they ever fully separate the two? Through the late 1990s, he continued choosing roles that demanded psychological intensity. In Sweet and Lowdown, 1999, he played a fictional jazz guitarist defined by ego and insecurity. Another Oscar nomination followed. There was a pattern emerging. Hollywood rewarded him when he portrayed damaged men struggling with pride, shame, and volatility. These were not like characters. They were not safe. They carried emotional pressure. And Penn delivered that pressure with unsettling precision. Was he simply skilled at accessing darkness, or was he drawing from something already present inside him? Then came Mystic River in 2003, directed by Clint Eastwood. The film required Penn to portray a father shattered by the murder of his daughter. There is a scene, the street, the police line, the scream, that became one of the most replayed dramatic moments of the decade. It was raw, physical, almost painful to watch. In 2004, he won his first Academy Award for Best Actor. He stood on stage, composed but visibly tense. No triumphant grin, no sweeping gesture, just controlled acknowledgement. Even in victory, there was restraint. 5 years later, in 2009, he won again for Milk, portraying activist Harvey Milk. The role demanded vulnerability, layered over conviction. He delivered both. 2 Oscars within 5 years placed him in rare company. Less than a dozen actors in modern Academy history have achieved that distinction. By any measurable standard, this was the peak. Prestige, recognition, authority. He was no longer just talented. He was established, respected, powerful within the industry. Yet the spotlight did not soften him. If anything, it sharpened the scrutiny. Interviews remained unpredictable. Public appearances carried a certain guarded intensity. He did not cultivate charm for late-night talk shows. He did not smooth out his edges for broader appeal. In an era where celebrity branding was becoming increasingly polished, Penn remained rough. That roughness became part of the myth. Admirers called it authenticity. Critics called it volatility. Which label was closer to the truth? His personal life also remained complex. His marriage to Robin Wright, which began in 1996, appeared more stable than his first. They had 2 children. For years, They presented a quieter image compared to the Madonna era, but even that stability faced strain. Reports of separation surfaced more than once before their eventual divorce in 2010. Success in career does not automatically produce harmony at home. When the cameras stop rolling, the work of control becomes personal. During this period, he also deepened his involvement in political causes. He traveled to Iraq in 2002 before the U.S. invasion. He publicly criticized government policy. He visited Venezuela and met with political leaders. These actions intensified public reaction. Some praise his courage. Others question his judgment. An actor with 2 Oscars now stepped into geopolitical conversations. The spotlight widened beyond cinema, but stepping into controversial spaces invites resistance. And resistance, for someone who has long operated in conflict mode, can feel familiar. By the end of the 2000s, Sean Penn occupied a rare position. He was both critically untouchable and publicly polarizing. Directors saw discipline and depth. Media outlets still anticipated flashes of anger. Audiences admired his performances, but remained uncertain about the man himself. The peak had arrived, but it was not serene. It was charged. At this level of fame and achievement, many actors pivot toward comfort, safer roles, safer statements, controlled public images. Penn did not fully pivot. The intensity that fueled his greatest performances did not disappear with success. It continued beneath the surface, coexisting with accolades. The industry celebrated him, the public watched him, and somewhere between those two forces, the same tension that marked his youth remained active. When a man reaches the top while still carrying the habits of survival from his early battles, what happens next? By the time Sean Penn held his second Oscar in 2009, the narrative should have been complete. 2 Academy Awards, decades of acclaimed performances, a place secured in Hollywood history. But the tension that followed him since the 1980s never fully disappeared. It only evolved. And beneath the prestige, the same volatility remained close to the surface. His arrests in the mid to late 1980s were not isolated footnotes. They shaped perception. In 1987, after violating probation by punching an extra on the set of colors, he was sentenced to 60 days in jail. He served 33. For most actors, incarceration at the height of rising fame would permanently derail momentum. Yet Penn returned to work almost immediately. The industry did not exile him. Instead, it absorbed him. Talent outweighed scandal. But what does it do to a person when consequences feel temporary, when skill repeatedly shields you from long-term fallout? The accusations tied to his first marriage with Madonna lingered for decades. Allegations of abuse surfaced and were later publicly disputed. In 2015, Madonna herself denied that he had assaulted her. Still, the cultural memory of that turbulent relationship never faded. Headlines from the 1980s remain searchable. Public perception rarely resets fully. A reputation can harden even when details blur. When your past follows you into every interview room, does it make you defensive, or does it reinforce the identity others expect from you? His second marriage to Robin Wright seemed steadier on the surface. They married in 1996 and built a family. For years, the relationship appeared grounded compared to the Madonna era, but there were multiple separations before the divorce was finalized in 2010. The reasons were complex, private, layered, yet the pattern is visible. Long stretches of intensity, followed by fracture. Publicly, he maintained composure. Privately, the strain accumulated. Can a man who operates at emotional extremes sustain domestic stability without friction? During this period, his confrontations with paparazzi continued intermittently. Incidents in the 2000s included aggressive exchanges and legal issues tied to photographers. In 2009, he was charged with vandalism and battery after kicking a paparazzo. The charges were later reduced. Again, the cycle repeated. Confrontation, legal process, reduction, return to work. Each episode reinforced the dual narrative. Genius on screen, instability off it. Yet the darker tension was not only external, it was internal. Penn often spoke about anger not as something he regretted, but as something he experienced intensely. In interviews, he appeared guarded, even suspicious of media framing. His tone suggested that he viewed many confrontations as defensive rather than offensive. To him, the camera was intrusion. The question was provocation. The system was adversarial. When you believe you are constantly being tested or misrepresented, anger can feel justified. But justification does not neutralize damage. There is a psychological pattern worth examining. Many of the roles that earned him acclaim involve men who feel cornered. In Mystic River, his character is a father overwhelmed by grief, then driven toward vengeance. In Milk, he plays a man balancing vulnerability with unyielding resolve. These characters operate under pressure. They hold emotion tightly until it erupts or transforms. Penn portrayed them with extraordinary credibility. That credibility suggests familiarity. Whether drawn from observation or personal experience, the intensity was authentic. Does prolonged immersion in emotionally charged roles heighten existing volatility? Or does it simply reveal it? After his divorce from Robin Wright, his life did not quiet. He entered another high-profile relationship with actress Charlize Theron, which ended in 2015. The pattern of intense attachment, followed by abrupt separation, resurfaced. Not every relationship breakdown signals instability, but repeated cycles of intensity and rupture can reflect difficulty sustaining equilibrium. When conflict becomes a familiar emotional register, calm can feel foreign. Meanwhile, his activism placed him in high-stakes environments. In 2010, after the devastating earthquake in Haiti, Penn founded the J/P Haitian Relief Organization. He worked on the ground, coordinating aid, meeting displaced families, engaging with local leadership. The effort was substantial and widely acknowledged. Here, the same intensity that once fueled confrontation was redirected toward crisis response. But crisis is still conflict, only in a different form. Did he gravitate toward disaster zones because they matched his internal tempo? Then came one of the most controversial chapters of his later life. In 2015, he secretly met with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the Mexican drug lord who was at the time one of the most wanted criminals in the world. The interview, later published by Rolling Stone in 2016, drew global attention. Shortly after the meeting became public, El Chapo was captured by Mexican authorities. Questions arose about whether the contact had contributed to tracking him. Mexican officials reportedly investigated aspects of the encounter. Penn denied facilitating any arrest. But once again, he had placed himself in proximity to danger, scrutiny, and political complexity. For some, the El Chapo interview reflected courage and journalistic ambition. For others, it demonstrated reckless ego. The optics were undeniable. A two-time Oscar winner sitting across from a fugitive drug lord in a remote location. This was not a studio set. It was real. The stakes were real, and Penn chose to enter that space. Was this activism, curiosity, or a pattern of seeking intensity wherever it exists? Across decades, one thread remains consistent. Sean Penn does not retreat from confrontation. He approaches it, whether facing cameras, political leaders, disaster zones, or criminal figures. He moves toward friction rather than away from it. That approach can produce impact. It can also produce chaos. Internally, such a life carries cost. Sustained vigilance, sustained readiness to defend, sustained exposure to high-stress environments. These conditions strain anyone. Fame magnifies the strain. Every outburst becomes a headline. Every misstep becomes archival. The man who once resisted being defined by a comedic surfer stereotype became defined by intensity. In attempting to control his narrative, he sometimes reinforced the most volatile parts of it. The collapse here is not a single dramatic implosion. It is cumulative. It is the erosion of ease, the difficulty of softening, the inability to fully separate performance from personality. When anger becomes part of your brand, disentangling yourself from it requires more than restraint. It requires transformation. The question is not whether Sean Penn possesses discipline. His body of work proves he does. The question is whether discipline in craft translates to discipline in temperament. Over and over, his career demonstrates mastery of emotion within a scripted environment. Over and over, his personal history demonstrates struggle when the environment is unscripted. If rage fuels brilliance under controlled conditions, what happens when there's no director to call cut? If there's a visible shift in Sean Penn's trajectory, it begins in 2010, not with a film release, not with an award, but with an earthquake. On January 12, 2010, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck Haiti, killing over 200,000 people and displacing more than 1 million. Within days, Penn was on the ground, not as a visiting celebrity for cameras, but as an organizer. He co-founded what became J/P Haitian Relief Organization and helped manage one of the largest displacement camps in Port-au-Prince. For months, he coordinated food distribution, sanitation, shelter logistics. This was not symbolic activism. It was operational. The man known for confrontation was now immersed in humanitarian structure. Was this redirection? Or was it simply conflict in a different form? Witnesses described him in Haiti as focused, disciplined, hands-on. He slept little. He argued with officials. He pushed for resources. The same intensity that once targeted photographers was now aimed at bureaucracy. Anger had not vanished. It had been channeled. But channeling is not the same as healing. In crisis zones, urgency justifies sharp edges. In disaster, there's always something to fight. Did relief work provide a socially acceptable outlet for a temperament built on urgency? Over the next decade, Penn continued stepping into geopolitical flashpoints. He traveled to Cuba and met with Fidel Castro in 2008. He visited Iraq before the U.S. invasion in 2002. He went to Venezuela and interviewed Hugo Chavez. In 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he was again present in Kiev, documenting and publicly supporting Ukrainian leadership. Time and again, he chose unstable ground. For supporters, this demonstrated courage and engagement beyond Hollywood comfort. For critics, it reflected a pattern, proximity to tension as a way of existing. When normal life feels too quiet, does chaos become familiar terrain? The El Chapo interview in 2015 remains one of the most defining episodes of this phase. Arranging a clandestine meeting with Joaquin Guzman while he was a fugitive required secrecy, intermediaries, and risk. The article published by Rolling Stone in January 2016 drew global scrutiny. Mexican authorities suggested contact had aided in tracking Guzman's communications. Penn denied facilitating any capture and emphasized that the intent was to open dialogue about drug policy. Regardless of interpretation, the image was powerful. A Hollywood actor seated across from a cartel leader deep in hiding. It blurred lines between journalism, activism, and personal daring. Was he amplifying stories others feared to approach? Or was he again stepping toward danger because it felt aligned with his identity? Meanwhile, aging introduced another variable. Entering his 50s and 60s, Penn no longer fit the bad boy mold of the 1980s. Physical intensity evolves with time. Public tolerance shifts. The industry itself changed, with social accountability movements reshaping how past behaviors are judged. In this new landscape, past volatility carried different weight. Redemption arcs are no longer granted automatically. They require reflection. They require visible growth. Has Penn offered that, or has he remained fundamentally unchanged, only redirected? There is evidence of recalibration. His humanitarian work in Haiti continued for years. J/P Haitian Relief Organization later transitioned operations to local leadership. He spoke publicly about the need for long-term commitment rather than symbolic charity. In interviews, his tone occasionally softened when discussing service. But even in reflection, intensity remained present. It is difficult to disentangle conviction from confrontation in his personality. A different kind of rebirth does not always mean becoming calm. Sometimes it means becoming purposeful. The young actor who punched photographers out of reactive anger became an older man arguing policy and infrastructure in disaster zones. The energy was similar. The target shifted. Yet transformation measured by intention must also be measured by stability. True rebirth suggests integration. Anger acknowledged, not merely redirected. Has that integration occurred, or has conflict simply found new arenas? Sean Penn's life does not present a clean redemption narrative. It presents adaptation. The same traits that fueled early volatility, intensity, resistance to authority, unwillingness to stay silent, now appear within structured activism. This could be maturity, it could be evolution, or it could be continuity in different clothing. When a man built his identity around refusing to back down, can he ever fully lay down the armor, or does he only change the battlefield? Today, Sean Penn exists in a different position than the young man who once served 33 days in jail, or the middle-aged actor who held 2 Oscars within 5 years. He is in his 60s. The headlines are less frequent. The volatility no longer dominates the news cycle the way it once did. But reputation does not disappear. It settles, it becomes layered, and legacy begins to form whether a person intends it or not. Within the film industry, his standing remains formidable. 2 Academy Awards for Best Actor, 5 total Oscar nominations. Performances in Mystic River, Milk, Dead Man Walking, and Sweet and Lowdown are still cited in acting classes and retrospectives. Directors continue to describe him as fearless, committed, emotionally exact. His craft is not in question. The precision, the ability to summon internal conflict on cue, the refusal to dilute a role for likability. Those qualities define his artistic legacy. But outside cinema, the narrative is more complicated. The arrests of the 1980s remain part of his biography. The turbulence of his first marriage, the confrontations with paparazzi, the polarizing political engagements, the El Chapo meeting. None of it vanishes simply because time passes. For some observers, these incidents represent growth followed by redirection. For others, they represent a lifelong pattern of operating on the edge. Legacy, in this case, is not singular. It splits. His humanitarian work in Haiti remains one of the most substantial chapters of his later life. Thousands received aid through his organization. Camps were managed. Infrastructure was supported. This was not a weekend gesture. It was sustained effort. In interviews, Haitian officials acknowledge the scale of involvement. That contribution stands independently of celebrity drama. It is measurable, concrete. But philanthropy does not erase past behavior. It coexists with it. The question becomes not which version is real, but how both versions fit together. Culturally, Sean Penn embodies a certain archetype of American masculinity from the late 20th century. Intense, confrontational, unwilling to bend publicly. That archetype once carried a kind of mystique. In the current era, it is examined more critically. Younger audiences assess past conduct through different standards. In that shift, Penn's legacy may continue to evolve. What once seemed like raw authenticity may now be interpreted as unmanaged aggression. Interpretation changes as culture changes. And yet, the performances endure. The scream in Mystic River still resonates. The vulnerability in Milk still holds weight. Acting is preserved in film. Temperament is preserved in memory. The contrast between those two is what defines his long-term imprint. Will history ultimately frame him as one of the finest actors of his generation, whose personal intensity complicated his image? Or as a volatile figure whose talent repeatedly protected him from deeper consequence? The answer may depend on which part of his story future audiences choose to emphasize: the craft, the conflict, or the collision between them. If greatness and instability have traveled together for decades in one man's life, which one will outlast the other when the spotlight finally fades? Sean Penn's story does not resolve neatly. There is no single moment of redemption, no single fall from grace. Instead, there's a through line: intensity. From Malibu to jail cells, from Oscar stages to disaster zones, the same force appears again and again. It built performances that earned 2 Academy Awards. It also built confrontations that shaped his reputation. The industry rewarded him for portraying men on the brink: grieving fathers, defiant activists, wounded souls holding anger just beneath the surface. Audiences felt those performances because they were convincing. Perhaps they were convincing because the emotion was not fabricated. It was accessed, and access comes with cost. Talent can transform rage into art. Discipline can structure emotion within a scene. But life offers no director to control the frame. Outside the set, anger does not arrive with lighting cues or scripted boundaries. It moves freely. It leaves consequences. Sean Penn mastered intensity as an actor, Whether he ever fully mastered it as a man remains an open question. If the same fire that fueled his greatest work also fueled his most controversial moments, then his life becomes a study in duality, proof that brilliance and volatility can share the same source. And when the awards are archived and the headlines fade, what will remain clearer? The genius on screen or the battles he carried beyond it?